Afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. You can have the music fade off dramatically in the background. My name is Jody Sanford, and I'm the Dean at the Evans School. And I'm so grateful that you've all joined us for the fourth event that we've had in the series. It's the Dean's Forum that I've called on focusing on how race is intricately connected to public policy. So this particular topic, we're going to take stock of where we are in assessing racial reckoning and really thinking about the implications of that for public policy. And I am really excited about this conversation. I think the forums overall are really trying to move into the space that I think public universities occupy, which is really to talk about important issues and plant seeds for courageous conversation and action. And in our work, we really want to keep front and center how defaults about whiteness is something that
now I'm on.
Are pretty comfortable with. And so I'd encourage everybody to be mindful and just mute themselves on Zoom. If you want to show your video, that's great. We are going to be having a question session as we go. And so even though we're on Zoom, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So feel free to ask any clarifying questions in the chat as we go. But then we'll also be collecting the other questions that you have. And my colleague will be feeding them back to me so that we can bring your questions into the conversation. So I'm just going to settle. And before we begin, I want to start our session by doing a practice that we do here at the Evans School, which is to acknowledge the Coast Salish people on whose land we study and work here at the University of Washington. Their ancestors have resided here since time immemorial, and they continue to live in this place today, deeply rooted in their cultural traditions. And we also acknowledge that the country was built from land theft and genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement and forced labor of Black people. And obviously these acknowledgements are just a small gesture, but in making them, we recognize that it's our responsibility to learn and share the history and to bring collaborative and accountable relationships where together we can shape just public policy. And so now we'll turn to the topic of our forum. Last fall, the New York Times ran an op-ed, was actually written by one of our guests, about the changing public opinions and support for Black Lives Matter. And then I heard a podcast about this, and I started listening more deeply to the conversations I was hearing about public policy, personally as a white woman, noting what do white people talk about together at this time? Are we talking about race as much as we used to? What does that mean if we're not? Last fall, we did a program for undergraduate students that was titled From Protest to Policy. And it was clear that the murder of George Floyd and the events that happened in 2020 shifted public policy and investments that were done in the Pacific Northwest region. And that's what we emphasized in that program. But then I began to wonder what might be happening now as understanding of the work of racial reckoning began to shift. And so that is really the origins of this particular panel. And I'm joined with three people, and that's going to be the conversation that we have. Jennifer Chudy is an assistant professor of political science who studies race and public opinion. Stephan Blanford is the executive director at the Children Alliance, which is a statewide nonprofit organization focused on improving the well-being of children by affecting positive changes in public policy. And he's an alum of the Evans School and is a member of my Dean's Council. And Sarita Siqueiros Thornburg is the executive director of strategy, evaluation, and learning at the Puget Sound Education District. And this is one of the 9 regional agencies that serve districts and tribal compact schools to improve educational programs from early childhood to high school. And so I wanted to bring these people together, Jennifer, to kind of help us shape what is happening in public opinion nationally, and Stephan and Sarita to talk about What are they seeing as leaders as they advocate for policies, implement policies, and what implications might that have for all of us who want to be intentional about understanding the relationship between racialized societies and the policies and institutions that we shape? So I think I'm going to begin by inviting the panelists to introduce themselves and answer the question, what part of your expertise are you really bringing to this conversation?
One of us go first?
Sure, Stephan, why don't you go first?
Introducing myself, I'm Dr. Stephan Blanford. I am the executive director of the Children's Alliance in Seattle, Washington, and a proud graduate class of 2005 from the Evans School. I served as a school board director. I was elected and served for a 4-year term on the Seattle Public Schools Board, and I hope no one holds that against me. I tried to be a good school board director while I was in that role. And in my current position, we spend a lot of time talking about race and racism and social policy because we aspire to be an anti-racist organization, and we are very explicit in our advocacy for Black and Brown children here in Washington State. So that's I'm a Black man. I am the proud father of a college freshman, and we spend a lot of time talking about racial issues. And she has educated me as almost as much as I've been educated by institutions of higher education on that topic.
Thanks. Jennifer, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure. Hello, my name is Jennifer Chudy, and I am an assistant professor of political science at Wellesley College, which is a small liberal arts college outside of Boston. And I do, the teaching aspect of being a professor is I teach about American politics, public opinion, political psychology, and race in American politics. But the research side of being a professor is really centered on understanding white people's attitudes about race and how that impacts the way they understand politics. And I'll provide more background on that in a little bit, but I'm specifically interested in white people who feel distress or sometimes guilt over Black suffering and the ways that manifests into their political behavior. Studying this in the aftermath of the Obama election, where people were wondering who are the white people who are so enthusiastic about Obama, but it has become, it remains, I would argue, a still relevant topic, especially as we saw in the summer of 2020. So I am from the Northeast. I didn't expect to end up back here, but I guess that's what happens sometimes. And I learned everything I know about political science from a professor, Scott Allard, who is now at the University of Washington. So I feel that connection to the institution. So thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Thank you. And Sarita, you are next.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Or afternoon, I guess at this point. I'm Sarita Siqueiros Thornburg. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm Executive Director of Strategy, Evaluation, and Learning at the Puget Sound Educational Service District. Lovely to see lots of old friends in the audience and current friends and partners. At the Puget Sound ESD, we've been on a bit of a journey to become an anti-racist multicultural organization since 2008, and that means lots of different things. Within the organization and our strategy, evaluation, and learning team, we're really our purpose is to support racially just and humanizing school systems through evaluation and data capacity building. So that's where I live in my professional life. And I am a proud Evans alumna from 2005 and have 2 wonderful, sweet kids in Seattle Public Schools. So experience the education system in lots of different ways. So thanks so much for having me.
So what I imagined is that we are going to have Jennifer set the stage a little bit. I referenced a New York Times article, and she and a colleague were looking at people in the world's opinion, support of Black Lives Matter. It was a very specific question. But she, as she suggested, does a lot of research on public opinion in the nuanced ways around racial sympathy and white guilt and social desirability and how those opinions translate into action. And so I asked her to give us just a brief overview of some of these concepts so that it can be something that Stephan and Sarita and I engage around. So Jennifer, I think you're in the driver's seat for the slides.
Great, just I'll share my screen. This is just to provide us with some kind of common language and concepts as we go into this topic. And so, as I've mentioned, I study white American voters, and I'm a political scientist, which is typically broken into two branches: people who study institutions like courts and bureaucracies, and people who study voters. And I study voters, and among the big group of voters in the US, I study white voters. And it's a major finding from this literature that if you want to understand what motivates white voters, well, there are many things, but one thing that really motivates many of their political decisions is white racial prejudice. And this has been a established but also disputed finding in the political science literature for decades now. And so there's good reason to focus on white racial prejudice. First of all, research suggests it's pretty widespread. The majority of white Americans, if we put them on a measure of prejudice, have medium to high levels of racial prejudice. But also it has very pernicious and powerful effects as well. So research has found that the higher a white person's level of prejudice, the more likely they are to oppose racially based social programs, such as public housing measures, affirmative action, redistributive policies that target African Americans specifically. So as prejudice goes up, support for those measures tends to go down. But as this final question suggests here, I've started to wonder, well, not started, it's been for years I've wondered whether there are other important racial attitudes. And this was really brought about by the election of Barack Obama in 2008. And the white people who supported him seemed to support him, not just because they were a Democrat and he was a Democrat, or they were done with Bush and he wasn't Bush, but there seemed to be maybe something extra that contributed to their enthusiasm for who would become the first Black president. So I started working on this idea, which I call racial sympathy, and I define this as white people who feel distressed about Black suffering. So an important distinction here is this is not the opposite of the prejudice that I described on the previous slide. It's not that white people who are high in racial sympathy, who feel strong distress over Black suffering, have no prejudice. But in fact, white Americans can carry simultaneously prejudice, so negative stereotypes, antipathy towards Black Americans, but they could also feel distressed over Black American circumstances. And so one finding that I tried to highlight is that white Americans can have kind of this ambivalence. They can have within them distress over Black suffering, but then also maybe residual antipathy or subscription to negative stereotypes. So even with those caveats, I do find that racially sympathetic white Americans are more likely to support public policies that are perceived to benefit African Americans. So if on the previous slide, there's a relationship I highlighted between higher levels of prejudice and more opposition to race-based policies, racially sympathetic folks, the higher they get in racial sympathy, the more they support these policies that other parts of white population oppose. So far this sounds like a step in the direction of racial equality, and it is. Some people read it as kind of a positive spin on where the country is with respect to race. But work I've been doing recently highlights that there are some important limits to this racial sympathy. So racial sympathy has a very strong relationship with public opinion. So public opinion is what people think about certain policies, but it doesn't always have a strong relationship with public behavior. So I find that racially sympathetic white people, they support affirmative action, they support affordable housing, policies like that. But they might not always act on it. So over the last few years, I've been trying to understand where and why this disconnect happens. And I have a few reasons that I bring to you today, but I'd be interested to hear your opinions as well. So one is this idea of social desirability. So what that means is that as humans, we often want people to think favorably about us. It's a pretty universal human tendency, but people vary in how much they care about what other people think about them. And the extent to which they vary is called the tendency to adhere to socially desirable behavior. So you can imagine a white person who wants everyone to like them and is in a social circle where racial justice is emphasized, may just say that they feel racially sympathetic, but it's only to impress other people or have other white people or maybe even not white people think favorably about them. So in this case, racial sympathy might not map onto political behavior because the white person is not being very sincere about their feelings. But another possibility that I look at is that white people could feel very sincerely distressed about Black suffering, which is the definition of racial sympathy, but the behaviors they elect to pursue are primarily private or individual and not really political or policy-based. So, in contrast to social desirability, which is kind of like they're faking it, this explanation is a little bit like they're genuine, but they channel it into solutions that are not very structural or aimed at changing policies or outcomes, but solutions that are more private. So when I've talked with some white racial justice activists, and I have done a number of surveys, and I find there is a really strong preference for these individual level behaviors, such as reading books, anti-racist books, such as the ones that I put on the slide, or listening to people of color. You can see how these are very private. A book is something you do without anyone else around, or you could do without anyone else around. But they're more reluctant to pursue political avenues for change, such as putting pressure on politicians or campaigning for candidates who prioritize racial justice attitudes, policies, or really kind of germane to my interest as a political scientist. I don't find that this maps onto whether or not they vote. So that is a snapshot of what I've been working on, and I hope it provides some food for thought for our conversation today. So I will stop sharing my screen and take it back to you.
That's awesome. Thank you for offering that. I know as a scholar, it takes years and years and years to boil things down to a few slides. So part of what I'm wondering, Stephan and Sarita, you play roles in policy and systems change here. What's your reaction? First, maybe just to this idea of prejudice and racial sympathy as being different from each other.
It strikes me, without having done a tremendous amount of research on this topic, there are other aspects of the racial dynamics in America that I have done research on, but it strikes me as having a lot of truth in it. My personal experience as a Black man, I frequently engage with white folks and feel like there's a distinct difference between individual actions and more outward actions that transform systems. And, as a systems leader and as someone that thinks a lot about the state legislature and, politics in general, I'm always struck by folks that are willing to take individual actions, but hesitate to think about systems change work that needs to occur in order for those individual actions to be amplified or magnified to such a level that they actually do change systems.
I guess just to build on what Stephan is saying, it does, in my experience, live in the kind of both and space. So I think about what we can control as individuals, and what we control is a particular sphere of influence. And so for some of us, having some big impact politically feels out of our reach or beyond us, or what can I as one person do? Whereas if I can be compassionate and generous in my interactions with BIPOC people or with the Black people in my community, then that's something that is meaningful to me as somebody who's a good person. So I guess in my experience, it's both are important, both can have an impact. We can't know the impact of those individual interactions with other human beings. It's kind of beyond our understanding. And at the end of the day, what's the evidence for change that's actually taken place is really the what's going to make a difference for the current and future generations. So it's kind of like that in-between gray space that I see a lot in my world.
It's not helpful that I'm the forum convener and I have myself muted. Jennifer, it's one of the things I was wondering, why do political scientists make this distinction between the personal actions that are connected to opinion and the public actions? Like what, help us understand why that's something that's done.
Yeah, I should say some scholars in kind of adjacent fields have made this distinction. So I found this this idea in an environmental studies journal. So you can want to, save the planet. It's relevant because today's Earth Day, and there's a lot of focus on bringing your reusable tote bag and buying your Prius, and not as much attention on the policies that deal with public transportation access, which of course would have far bigger reach than many tote bags. And I've talked with some of my colleagues who study neoliberalism in the US, and there is a propensity here to look at big problems and try to individualize them. But I don't know if that's just so obvious that that's why political scientists don't study it, but it does seem to be a really kind of striking trait of how many Americans think about solving problems. The environmentalists would say it has a consumer dimension to it. The tote bag is something you bought, the Prius is something you bought. In this case, though, anti-racist books are also things you buy. And so there's that dimension to it too, buying your way to a solution. But for many years, there's been an attitude of shrinking the influence of the government. And so pursuing private solutions to public problems is, I think, an outgrowth of that kind of more general American tendency.
Stephan, you have a job in trying to activate people to take action at the state level. And Sarita, I think you have a job trying to help people take action in local educational issues that affect their lives. And so how does that, how are you seeing that show up, particularly around this kind of moment that we all experienced, right? That may or may not have been different than past moments, but there was a different public dialogue in 2021 about racial disparities and anti-racism. And a lot of institutions, including the one that I lead, stepped into that language.
Yeah, that's a great one. So I took my position, I started my position in June of 2020. There were people still marching in the streets around George Floyd when I accepted the job and started work. And part of the reason that I accepted the position was I felt like, as I'm getting to the tail end of my career, I wanted to be a change agent and actually start to grapple with this question of individual action versus community or group collective action. Because I know that from my school board experience, I know that that those individual acts are not enough to move systems in the direction that they should be moving. And so I find this research really, really compelling. What are the catalysts that are going to move more collective action, particularly around issues of race, which I think may be the most difficult to get people actually moving in the direction that they need to be moved. I will say that in the years, in the 2 years, almost 2 years now that since I took the role, I've been a real student of watching how the energy that was manifesting in meetings that I was in during that time, how that has changed and how it's been diluted over time by other issues where we're not talking about race in the way that we were even in 2020. And I think, you know, we try to mobilize activists, people who have already put their hands up and say, I want to be part of systemic change. We try to keep them motivated and sharpen their analysis so they can make a difference. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to have conversations about race. The door was opened, but you know, I'm a student of, I have some understanding of hegemony, cultural hegemony, and the idea that a system gets knocked off its axis by an event like the murder of George Floyd in 2020, and then it self-corrects to get back to center, and very rarely does it actually move very far. And I think we are seeing that self-correction back to the norm, which was we don't talk about race. And I fear that we're quickly moving back to a place where it is not as acceptable to have these difficult conversations that move systems.
I want to push on this a little bit, Stephan, because I think as I listen to Jennifer, I think what she's saying is that even if we were talking about it, that might not be enough. And I referenced the program that we ran from protest to policy, learning from the Seattle experience, because one of the things that I was so impressed by Seattle as a newcomer was that the conversations were happening, the protests were happening, and policy changed, right? There was change in policy by the Black Caucus, and they moved things forward. Now, some of that has now, as you're suggesting, shifting back. But I guess, to me, this thing of like, I'm worrying that we aren't talking and we're not doing systems change. And I know you're worrying about the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm on record. I actually was quoted making the statement that Seattle, and I think the region, is full of what I call passive progressives, people who, instead of actively advocating for and working for the things that they care about, they're passive progressives. And that experience or that statement comes from my experience as a school board director, who was elected by the largest percentage of people in Seattle that had, in a contested race, that had ever, I had the largest percentage of victory in any contested race in Seattle Public Schools history. And I was very proud of that. And I thought, oh, there is this huge wave of people who are down for what I'm advocating for, which was pretty explicitly focused on anti-racism in Seattle Public Schools. And then what I discovered once I became a school board director was the exact opposite of that. And so that's where this idea of people who are willing to elect someone, but are not willing to do the work to support that person in their systems change advocacy work. I think it is I can't speak to what it means for the entire state or the region or the country as a whole. But I think we in Seattle have a lot of self-congratulatory tendencies. Like we think we figured it out here in Seattle, though the reality, the data would suggest that we don't have things figured out any better than many of the cities in the South, or cities that you might think of as still having pretty significant racial issues.
So Sarita, you have been here a long time. As a newcomer, I'm curious what your reaction is to what Stephan just said.
I mean, it resonates. I also think it hasn't, in terms of the practicalities of what Stephan has seen in his role at Children's Alliance, it has been not so much that case for me at the ESD. And there's something about having, when folks have a higher sense of purpose, a sense of service, a grounding in their why, opinions change. It's impermanent. We're all different people than we were yesterday. And so in my world, there are a lot of people who are grounded in their why and a sense of service and a clear view of injustice. So whether they identify as people of color, as white people, that's kind of what guides them. And so for those folks, and I'm lucky to work with a lot of them, the comings and goings of opinions, it just has less of an influence. So like the example of the real pushback on racial equity and LGBTQ rights in schools. And I'm sorry, I'm getting a message that my internet connection's unstable.
You're okay now.
Okay,
It was a
okay.
little blip. Yeah.
Little glitchy. Folks are still moving in the direction of putting into place structures that will outlive opinion and outlive the comings and goings of the fickleness of how people support or don't support our community. And so one of the examples that I think of internally to the ESD, we have now this, a requirement that all staff have a racial equity leadership competency that is part of the annual goal setting process for all of us. And so me as a person of mixed heritage who comes to the table with lots of privilege, unearned privilege. So how am I actually, what is the evidence in my everyday work of a racial equity advocacy body of work, and how would my supervisor know that that was happening, and how would the community that I'm in relationship know that that was happening, and seeing evidence of it? And that's part of my annual review, is what is my evidence of that? And so that's a journey for all of us to understand what does it mean to show up in spaces in really practical, visible ways. So I feel like the places where those kinds of pieces of infrastructure are in place, less movement back and forth when the overall public sentiment is moving towards something that is not supportive of racial equity overall. So sorry if that was a little bit rambly.
No, not at all. And I wonder, you mentioned in your introduction that the organization you work with and lead has been doing this work since 2008. Is there something about that length of focus or attention that matters in what you're experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's been really hard, and lots of productive and unproductive conflict, and people coming to the table best they can with the tools they have in their tool belt. And it's been a commitment for a long time. We attract staff who want to see that, and they push against leadership to see stronger evidence of it in their own experiences, which pushes leadership to make more visible changes themselves. And so I do think And our community, we've gotten a lot of really productive pushback from community members that we talk a lot, but we actually don't show up and do the work. And so to be in mutual relationship with folks and actually be responsive to that criticism. So that's been work that has been going on for a long time. So I do think that that makes a difference, and to have an organizational commitment to it and a leadership commitment to it.
It's a really live issue in the work of the Evans School with the young people who have come here for their master's degrees in particular, because, you know, I think they want this social movement change. And then we start talking about the kind of institutionalized things you're talking about. And there seems to be a disconnect sometimes. It's like, you know, they want the social movement. And I keep on saying, yeah, and if we don't institutionalize it, that comes and goes. But that's not a very satisfying answer to like talk about performance metrics and job descriptions and annual performance reviews. I just think it's an interesting piece as we're trying to grapple with what does this anti-racist commitment in institutions look like. Jennifer, one of the books that you cite in one of the articles I read is this book, which we'll put in the chat for people afterwards. This book tries to grapple with those ideas about institutionalizing change. Why has this been helpful in your own research?
Yeah, I think there's a sense that racism in America is very blatant and obvious. It's KKK and overtly racist speech, and that is definitely one iteration of racism. But if that's the only iteration you're looking for, you will miss the ways in which racial prejudice, which we just think is treating someone differently on the basis of their race, is kind of perpetuated like a conveyor belt. It's just going along without interruption. And the institutions of our government, of our financial system, of our educational system are just going to keep like a conveyor belt going on and producing outcomes that are unequal for races without the visible signs of like a KKK rally. And so people who study prejudice and racism have kind of designated different iterations of racism, not ranked them, but saying that they had different kind of different flavors or different iterations. And Professor Bonilla Silva's work, which is the book you held up, he's a sociologist, and he really focuses on the way in which institutions perpetuate this in a less overt way, and because he places the emphasis on institutions and rather than individuals, the title of his book is Racism Without Racists, because focusing on racists is again focusing at the individual level. If that's how racism exists, then all you have to do is get rid of the racists and things are better. But his point is that it's not merely the sum of individual preferences, but kind of to Sarita's point, how are those preferences formalized? How are they institutionalized in ways that may perpetuate racism without explicit nefarious racist action?
So either of you want to respond to that? Because the questions that this conversation is generating are blowing up. So I'm looking at this question list, but any comments in response to what you just said?
I cited that book frequently in my dissertation, and in my school board service, I would pull it out frequently and read parts of it, because Bonilla Silva's analysis of institutionalized racism and how deeply ingrained it is in, say, a school district, for example, and its practices, was instructive to me, nominally as the, at the very top of the org chart for this institution. How difficult is it to uproot racism, particularly when people are not, they don't realize their complicity in racist practices. And that was, in many ways, that was the biggest challenge that I faced during my school board service.
So we've been talking a lot about education because of your expertise. One of the questions we got is anybody to have your opinion about the governor establishing an executive order, really advancing and saying that he wants to be working on these issues about anti-racism and equity in the functioning of state agencies. And he established the Office of Equity. What are your opinions about that? Are those positive directions?
I can go. The folks I know and love who live in that world think that it is a wise move forward. I mean, I guess it's at the end of the day, what is the evidence of change is always going to be what we come back to. So yeah. I don't know, Stephan, your thoughts?
How I'd respond to it is there's a quintessential question in a system like a state government. Do you create an office of equity that has the response and you centralize all change in that department around the issue of equity? Or do you infuse it throughout every department in your state government, for example? And there's not really clear evidence that one theory of action is better than the other, one produces better results than the other. And so I think a systems leader has to really kind of interrogate what's to be gained and what's to be lost, what's the opportunity cost for centralizing equity inside of a particular office. I know for my experience, again, is in school systems, what happens frequently is when you centralize it in an office, it takes the responsibility for change away from Sarita's supervisor or some person. It takes the responsibility for doing the work away from that person until the Office of Equity comes in and does a training or whatever. And so there's something to be lost from that, the urgency. But frequently it, in the absence of someone that serves as a catalyst, which the Office of Equity can do, trying to require a large system with, say, 5,000 employees to all be working on equity at the same time is not a smart strategy. It's not one that's going to get you to results.
Well, and it also relates, I think, to some of the research that Jennifer and her colleagues do, because if we're seeing the opinion of some of those people going down, right, and that and you're telling stories about it not capturing people's attention in the same way in some circles. If you don't have those offices, then it can vaporize away. And you're also saying, but they can just be symbolic. And I think Sarita's point is right on, that it's all about implementation. Like, it's not that the offices are good or bad, but they can help create some stickiness.
Right.
And if they implement well, it can do incredible good.
But if they don't implement well, they can do more damage than exists, right? Because we know that there's a unbite at the apple phenomena that plays out, particularly around racial equity, where, and I know this because before I was executive director, I was a consultant and I did lots of trainings around this issue. And there's a perception that for those who are passively resisting racial equity changes in practice, that if you don't get it right, then there's an increased level of resistance to changing practice in the future. So you will encounter much more resistance. Why do we have to go to this training? It doesn't make any sense. It's not me, it's someone else that needs to change their practice. That makes it more difficult to acquire that stickiness that you were talking about.
Yeah, and I'll just say, after summer of 2020, which was, I tried to make the point in the op-ed, it was, hopefully one of the most unusual summers we'll have for a long time. If you'll recall, it was new in the coronavirus, everyone was locked down. So when you think about the George Floyd protests, you have to remember it grew out of such a specific scenario. It's hard to say how representative it is of Americans' interest or concern in these issues under more normal circumstances. But there were many policies and initiatives that were introduced following that summer. And when they came along, so did tremendous backlash to curb what a lot of the work that those policies were doing. And we saw that reverberate through the fall. And, I even see current discussions about critical race theory as a reaction to some of those conversations that began in 2020. So this is kind of to Stephan's point, you can introduce this and it can provoke some really some strong backlash among folks who are ready for that backlash, but also folks who may be receptive to it, but then they see the implementation of it go not as planned, and then they become skeptics as well.
Before we move on from this topic of institutionalization, some of the comments coming from the audience are asking, are there examples of institutions that are getting it right, that are trying to actually move forward and dismantle racist systems so that others can learn? Some people asked about your opinion about the well-established race and social justice initiative in Seattle. King County has a longstanding one as well. Obviously, Sarita is involved in leading one as well. But are there differences between places you're seeing that have been trying to do this work and places that maybe only try to start in 2020?
Yeah, we are a service agency, the Puget Zone Service, agency. And we work with partners, school district, municipality, and CBO partners to help them think through kind of what does change look like for them. So I'm thinking specifically of our strategy evaluation and learning team. So we've helped people do what they sometimes call equity assessments or equity audits, which I really don't like that phrase, to help them think through kind of what are the areas of their systems that are producing injustice for their kids of color and for their staff and families and communities of color. And in those spaces where they have kind of a general understanding that they know things aren't as they want them to be, but not necessarily the grounding or political will to kind of stick through it when people start pushing back or getting pissed off or feeling that sense of loss that comes up for some folks when we talk about redistributing resources differently. It's really, really easy for those folks to kind of go back to how things were because they don't have kind of a well of resources and grounding and a container to go back to when things get difficult. So because things will always get difficult and there are always going to be people who don't support it, especially these days when everything is so politicized in education. So I guess that's one thing that comes up for me is you need a strong grounding in your why in order to stick with it when things get hard and the pushback starts. So I think in places where they don't have that, it's hard for them to feel progress, and then folks get discouraged and it's hard to get momentum going again.
And I'd respond by saying my academic research was on schools and school districts that had sustained gap closure over several years. And the only variable that was consistently found in schools that had that gap closure was strong and authentic leadership. Someone, going to Sarita's point about being deeply grounded in your why, usually the leader, and frequently they were unsanctioned leaders, so not necessarily the principal of the school or the superintendent of a school district, but someone who is seen by other actors in the system as providing leadership and a strong analysis that allows others to see a new future, a new way of visualizing something different, and a recognition that what we're talking about is not a zero-sum game that someone has to lose in order for someone to win, but shifting that dynamic to we all do better when we all do better. And so I think those would be the indicators that I'd be looking for if I were doing a study on systems that were actually making a difference and responding to what Sarita very rightly says, is the difficult times that are inherent in trying to do this long-term systems change work.
Jennifer, one of the comments from the audience makes me wonder. So the question was, is there a tipping point of having enough people with racial sympathy in an organization to make a change or an institution? And I know most of your research has been in the general public, so it hasn't been focused in organizations, but has anybody started to explore that? Like, what's the dynamic? Is there a tipping point, right?
Yeah, I think, to my knowledge, I don't know of anyone who has explored it more with the organizational dynamics, but I can think actually of a parallel to what Stephan and Sarita have said, which is there is research in politics that people listen to a charismatic leader for better or worse. People may have a base level of sympathy, but for it to be activated, you may need someone to connect Black suffering to policy solution or change. And, a lot of my research suggests that on their own, white people are not necessarily seeing connections between distress over Black suffering, and that policies and institutions and systems would be places to go if they had that, right? They want to take it to the bookshelf or to making private donations, et cetera. So my instinct, based on what the other panelists would say, is that it might be less important to the kind of overall levels. I mean, obviously, if you have not a single racially sympathetic person there, that does not bode well. But what might be more important is catalyzing it and channeling it into tangible policies or outcomes that people could see institutionalized in the organization.
So that's a perfect transition to a lot of comments that had been happening in the chat about the individual and the systems and the disconnect between words and actions. So one person asked, do you think that disconnect is about the fact that words can be changed and individuals don't have to sacrifice anything? But when you're making policy change, it requires people losing resources or privilege. Is that the rub?
I'll start, and then hopefully people who are practitioners can add more reality to what I will say based on scholarship. But that is kind of hinting at a role of something called self-interest. How much money you have. If you're self-interested, you want to keep your money. If you have kids, you might be self-interested on their behalf, that their schools are good, etc. And the research on self-interest and race is actually less conclusive than you might imagine. And to explain, as one example, so as part of desegregation efforts in the 80s and 90s, there was, there were policies to bus children across cities and municipalities to desegregate the schools because, of course, the overall landscape is residentially segregated. And if a self-interest explanation was very powerful, we might expect white people who had kids to be the most resistant to these desegregation busing efforts. But in fact, researchers found there was no relationship between a white person having kids or not and their approval or disapproval of busing. So white people without kids didn't want the busing, and some white people with kids were okay with the busing. And so that's not a direct answer to the question, but if behavior was motivated purely by self-interest, we might see many different outcomes than we actually observe in American politics. So I think that certainly can play a role, and some research took criticism at that and said they looked at like trash collection, and they found that actually there was a relationship between wanting your sidewalk cleared and support for more municipal services. That was example of self-interest, but it's not as strong as we might suspect, given kind of the emotion that many white people bring to their opinions on racial issues. You think, oh, they must have a personal stake in the outcome. That is not always as clear, but that sense of personal stake might be there, but the actual instrumental personal stake may or not be there. But yeah, I'm interested to hear practitioners' views of this kind of, people will support a lecture for Black History Month, but if you were to make them do something with that time that was more effortful or resourceful, or taking, requiring their resources, that support might detract. What's your opinion based on the work that you've done?
I probably the clearest example in my mind is in 2021. Due to the advocacy of my organization and many other advocates around the state, we were able to pass a landmark bill, which invested about $850 million in early learning in Washington state. And then I spent a good portion of the summer and fall of last year talking to advocates in other states who were thrilled that Washington state made this large investment on behalf of its children. And the investment was for many legislators was specifically racially equity based, because there was a recognition that Black and brown kids don't have access to quality early learning settings in Washington state. And many of the providers who are providing that service are Black and brown providers. And so there was a racial equity component of this bill that was very clear and obvious to most people who were looking at it and finally making decisions on it. So it becomes a kind of a national model. And almost immediately upon the governor's signature, there are lawsuits and initiatives filed to overrule it, which we're fighting against now, trying to prevent that from happening. But I think it's a really clear example of self-interest when there's a perception that that it could, it's taxing wealthy people. So most of the people who are vetting it are not wealthy, are not super wealthy. But once the perception is that they may be impacted by it, which is the argument that those on the other side are making, is that you could be impacted by this, then there all of a sudden there's a chance that it may be overturned in the next few months. And so in my mind, that's a really clear example of how self-interest impacts the policymaking process when it is people of color and their interests that will be impacted.
I think what I would add has to do with kind of how it shows up in an organizational sphere, and so how white supremacy culture favors comfort. And so what that looks like within an organization that is like a very practical example. So we just took a look at all of our salary placements for all of our positions at our organization and did an analysis to see if there were disparities that showed up based on race. And so just going through the process of analyzing an institutional function like classification and compensation leads people to worry, like if it does this mean that the pot is smaller, or that things will be redistributed so that BIPOC staff can be brought up to the same level as their white counterparts? And what does that mean for me where I sit when I'm doing an excellent job where I am? And so this idea that Stephan spoke to earlier, that there's like this really corrupted idea of the zero sum, like the pie is only so big, and how white supremacy culture moves us away from having a more expansive understanding of what's possible. So when I think about this issue from like an organizational perspective, it's really just naming those things that are coming up and the fear that comes up when people feel like they're going to lose something, or that we don't have a colorblind approach to our work. And it's just having real person-to-person conversations about it, and then showing a process and outcome of doing things differently. It's helpful to help people move through that in a way that feels generative and supportive, and not reductive to their own contributions to an organization.
Before we leave the organizational level, Sarita, one of the questions from the audience was around your mentioning of audits, and that you didn't like that term. And the person said, I'm a firm believer in metrics, but how do we keep metrics from turning into quotas? When we tie these metrics or to outcomes, then you try to game the metric, right? And it gets into this kind of zero sum gain you're talking about. And so the worry, I think, from this commenter was that we're intentionally turning, with our organizational tools, we might be in fact moving for reinforcing the kind of zero sum culture you're talking about.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I live in the world of research and evaluation, which in the United States is steeped in white supremacy culture. So this is like a constant. And our wonderful, wonderful strategy evaluation and learning team is so good at this, at coming back and checking ourselves along the way. How are expansive characteristics showing up in our work? How are we living into our transformational values, and how are we not? Because the work inherently is going to be corrupted by white supremacy culture, because that's where we live. And so we learned so much from Indigenous ways of knowing and community-based participatory research, and really leaning into the place of narrative and storytelling, and who has a right to say what's important and what is success. And so 100% the metrics can really do harm. And so that's something that we constantly have to pay attention to, for sure. So thank you for that comment to the person who made it.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions in these comments, Jennifer, about racial sympathy. And is that idea, does it take us far enough? And how do you think about true commitment to these issues rather than just the concept of racial sympathy? So maybe I'll start there, and then I'm going to kind of stitch to a number of related things.
Well, I mean, the concept is what it is. I think what it results in is a separate question, which I'm trying to assess. It's a spectrum, so it's not like a white person is either racially sympathetic or they're not, but they fall from low to high. They also have prejudice. And so whether it goes far enough is more of kind of what things might activate or encourage the expression of racial sympathy, and what things may extinguish it. And so I've increasingly been looking at individuals' sense of efficacy. So efficacy is the idea that, it's two parts. One is internal efficacy, that you can change outcomes, political outcomes. And the second is that the system can be changed. And you can see how those are, related but separate. And so racial sympathy is this white distress over Black suffering. But if you're looking at what a white person does with that, it might some of that might have to do with how efficacious that white person feels. Do they feel that acting on it is going to bring about any change? And Sarita kind of alluded to this point early on. I mean, you know, as we've now established into this panel, the problem is widespread, institutionalized, huge. And so it may be understandable that a white person could look at that and feel overwhelmed. What's a little bit unusual is typically the people who look at the system and feel overwhelmed historically have been people of color who feel they don't see themselves represented. They don't have representatives that look like them. Voting is a more difficult process. And so it's a little bit unusual that I have found that many white people that I've looked at feel very low sense of efficacy, when traditionally we find that among people of color. But in terms of trying to understand why racial sympathy might take some white people far and some other white people less far, some of it is some white people just prefer these private activities. Some of it is, they don't understand that politics and systems could be a very, a forum to address these things. And then part of it might be they just have zero sense of efficacy, that they can bring about change and that the system will be responsive to it. So that's how I've tried to think about it. In terms of, I think there's I also have studied white guilt, which is separate from white sympathy. So a white sympathy is a white person sees Black suffering and just feels bad about it, but doesn't feel implicated by it, can look at it very separate from themselves. Whereas white guilt is an additional step where there's a sense of responsibility. And that is far, far less common among white people than is white sympathy. So there are different kind of attitudes or emotions that go further to this characterization. But the expression of it is kind of bound up in these other things that influence whether or not people do anything with the sympathy they have.
Yeah. So can I just make it, I think this idea of efficacy is connected, Sarita, to when you're talking about your colleagues who are have strong grounding in their why. Right? That's a way of talking about the academic concept of efficacy, I think. When you evoke them to me, it's like, it sounds like they know and they believe that if they stay connected to their why, they are going to be effective in the kind of systems change we're talking about.
Yeah, and that they have a higher calling or a higher purpose than the day-to-day things that are going to, that could potentially throw them off where they're headed. Yeah.
Stephan, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, as I was listening to Jennifer talk, I felt a little dissonance with the idea of white people acting on behalf of Black people out of sympathy, out of anything other than a recognition of Black people's value in the world. And I think it goes in some ways to a comment that we heard recently about white people's fickleness and inability to stay on task around a direction or a purpose. And I think that goes to the points that we were making earlier about how things go in cycles and why there's a need for sustained, steady progress on this issue in order for real systems change and different outcomes to occur. In the same way that we tell philanthropists to work with the nonprofit sector, not out of a sense of charity, but out of a sense of partnership. And the difference being one is not based in emotion, and the other is based in emotion, which is fickle or is not sustained over time. And in order for change to happen, there needs to be sustained action over a long period of time, particularly around something as ingrained and pernicious and invisible as racism is in the United States.
So I want to keep this thread going because there's some great comments in the chat. First of all, people, there's a lot of enthusiasm for your passive progressive term, Stephan.
Should have copyrighted it when I had a chance.
Yeah. And, wondering about when there's monoracial populations in urban areas, like, is that more likely to get these passive progressives? One person said, so can you say that individuals who have racial sympathy fall under the category of passive progressive because they do not follow through with their sympathetic feelings with action? So they're kind of take your idea and put it together. What do you think of that, the two of you, Jennifer and Stephan? Shall I read it again? How do you?
Yeah. Sorry, the connection kind of flickered for me. So
can you say that individuals who have racial sympathy fall under the category of passive progressives because they did not follow through their sympathetic feelings with action? That's other than personal.
Yeah, I would say that probably describes a lot of that. Not everyone, right? It's a spectrum. And this conceptualization of focusing on sympathy is because when many white people think about race, they think about it emotionally. They tend not to think about, one solution often is, oh, these white people just need to learn more. Learning is cognition. Like if I ask you what's 2 + 5, what your brain is doing is cognition. And that's very different than emotion. And most white people, no amount of just straight knowledge is going to shift them. It's for them emotional. But to Stephan's point, it does mean that it's volatile because part of being emotional is that, where 2 + 5 is going to be 7 on Friday afternoon and Monday morning, your emotional status is usually not as even. So, I mean, I do appreciate this distinction. And one of my colleagues at Wesleyan, he actually studies racial paternalism, which sounds similar. It comes from like ideas of colonialism and the white man's burden to help out disadvantaged groups. And some of that research suggests that white people who feel paternalistic want to do things like have the state take over school control of predominantly Black cities, as Michigan has done in Detroit, as Connecticut has done in Hartford. And that's a little bit different. The white people I study, they don't necessarily want to take authority away from Black people, but there can be an element of pity, which can be paternalistic to some white racially sympathetic people. But I would say, yes, many white people, they feel, not many, some white people, they feel racial sympathy, but they don't necessarily act on it. And my research is trying to understand why that action doesn't always materialize.
Stephan, I think people want you to do some research measuring passive progressivism. Well, that's your next calling after you transform and guard the early childhood investments.
Yeah, after you figure out how to get people to actually give you reasonable feedback, real feedback as to where they stand on an issue, which is, they're going to code their responses through a whole lot of lenses. And a Black man asking them that question is not one that's probably going to get the answer that I actually want.
There are a lot of powerful questions in the chat, and I don't think we're going to get to all of them. One of them pivots, Sarita, from what you last offered, which is if people are trapped in this zero-sum thinking around change and other things, are there strategies you've seen that shift people from that zero-sum thinking to thinking more about abundance in doing this work day in and day out in institutions?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is my Evans training. I don't know, but
I like that beginning to any answer.
First, I spent the first 5 years after my Evans training, like really thinking about memos. I will say that. How to do a 2-page memo. I feel
I'm
like
sorry we did that to you.
But just the consistency and the practice of reflection and a commitment to reflection. So a very tangible thing that it sounds so basic, But our team has a practice of looking at our colleague Matthew Gulbranson kind of synthesized some thinking and some research to come up with a transformational values framework that talks about white supremacy culture, and then what are the kind of the flip side of that, knowing that it's kind of a continuum. And so our team uses that as a reflection tool about, so right now we're putting together an evaluation plan for a statewide project. So just like the bread and butter of a program evaluation team, as we're sitting through the different stages of that design process, we're looking at those values and thinking, for me as the leader of the team, what's coming up for me in the space related to these values? I'm seeing a sense of scarcity, a scarcity mindset coming up, because I'm not sure we can actually do what we need to do with the resources. And each of us speaking into the space, how those values are coming up and how they're evidenced and kind of what we're doing and thinking, and just having a practice of doing that so that it disrupts a translation of those values into action. So I'm not making decisions based on a scarcity mindset that then will have negative repercussions down the line. So it is just, from where I sit, one way of doing it is just that everyday constant practice of interrogating and shifting that is just part of doing the work differently.
One of the other comments Representative Ibarra put in the comment is about paying attention to the data and the information, right? And in his place, he's seeing the education opportunity gap going in the right direction, closing. And that seems to fuel positive belief, right? When you can see you're making progress, right? It's really, really important. So again, we got some geeky policy people on this meeting, I'm telling you, because they're giving me like correlations between things. So I want to give you this one. Is efficacy related to sympathy or guilt? So if you have low efficacy and you have this sympathy, you aren't going to act. But if you have high efficacy and guilt, you're more likely to act.
Well, if we're geeking out, I'll say, you know, the way I test this is through an interactive regression. And I actually have not interacted guilt and efficacy. I mean, I will say, you know, and Stephan brought this point up earlier, it's emotional, and some emotions really get you reared up to act. And actually the emotion that does that the most, unfortunately, is anger. When you're angry, you want to act because you release the anger. Now, a problem with sympathy is it's kind of sad or distress. And sometimes when one feels sad or distressed, they can become like a hermit and kind of withdraw. And so, so that is why you need kind of this power, an additional power, which I'm speculating there, and have found there is an interactive relationship between the more sympathy and the more efficacy a white person feels, the more likely that is to translate into a political outcome. Guilt actually does have a more action-oriented element, because guilt has the white person thinking about their own contribution to the outcome. And so when someone feels implicated in a bad situation, you know, like you forgot your sister's birthday and your sister is sad, if you feel responsible for your sister's sadness, you're going to do something more about that than just observing your sister is sad. And so guilt does have more of an action element to it, because it involves the self and a damage to the ego in a way that sympathy is very other focused. It's not having the white person contemplate at all how their whiteness may have contributed to an outcome. So it needs an additional force to lift it into action is what I hope is going to be in my book. But that's enough of the geeking out. Okay.
There's a book coming. Cool. One very technical thing people want to know is efficacy correlated to socioeconomic status?
Yeah, that's why it's very curious to me that white people wouldn't feel it. Yeah, usually when the first scholars who studied efficacy in America in the 50s, when they wanted to understand who felt efficacious, it was the people with a lot of resources and the people with a lot of education. And that makes sense. Like, if I have those things, I feel more confident interacting with the government. And so it is curious to me to have surveyed and met white people who feel such low levels of efficacy, because kind of all the predictors of efficacy are often attributes that they exhibit.
So I have a couple. There's so many questions. I'm a little overwhelmed. I'm usually pretty good at this, but I'm like, okay. So I guess one more question, then I'm going to wrap, and then I'm going to give you guys the last word, which is, people are talking about the anti-Asian activities that have been really heightened around this pandemic time, and wondering if Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities are getting enough sympathy to move public opinion, and will that translate into policy change? You know, we've been talking about this very much in terms of Black and white, and the comment here is we don't have a movement like Black Lives Matter. Thoughts about that movement building kind of power, policy change space? It's okay for people to say, I don't know.
I think there's a danger in, and I don't think that the person who posed this question was suggesting this, but I think there's a danger in oppression Olympics. The idea that one group is in the worst possible place. I believe strongly in multi-racial coalitions of people that have experience with phenomena that are disproportionately impacting them, and people of goodwill who understand that in our democratic project, it is wrong to see suffering and not act on it. I believe in that more than I do in balkanizing different groups of oppressed people, and each one advocates for what they need. I'm a student of Martin Luther King, and he believed in multicultural advocacy strategies. I do believe that in the absence of, there are groups of people who their conditions have not been well publicized, and so there's a public education component that is absolutely necessary to get legislatures and Congress to understand that there's a problem here. And then we all need to work in support of solving those problems. I work for an organization that cares about kids, about children in Washington State, regardless of what race they are, but prioritizes those who are furthest away from their potential, and that frequently is Black and brown kids. And we're unapologetic in that advocacy for those kids. And so that's what I'd say in response to that.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I would say it's very hard to look at what happened in the summer of 2020 as any sort of indication for paths for advocacy or activism for other groups, because the Black experience is so unique in America that it's not like, oh, we saw this, issues related to Black people came up in 2020, so 21 we'll next see Latinx, and it's progress in America is not kind of linear in that way. I mean, I guess I would just say, although there might be white people who feel sympathy for Asian Americans, there are also many who feel that Asian Americans outperform white people on many metrics. They might be foreign, but they're super competent. All of those kind of ugly stereotypes might prevent an expression of sympathy, which is why I think if you wanted to kind of carry over some of these themes we've talked about to different groups, it really requires a history and contextualization of how like the history of that group in the US and how they've been treated. And so I think there are lessons to be learned about, when Americans think about race, there's kind of a complexity. It can be prejudice, it can be sympathy, it can be guilt, that you can carry that spirit of complexity into thinking about different communities. But everything I talked about was white attitudes towards Black people, which I wouldn't blanket apply to white attitudes towards other racial or ethnic minority groups.
Yeah. So 2 comments that I think are more directed at me, and I just want to pull them into the space. One person noted that a lot of the conversation today has been about white people and data, and asking, why are we doing that? Why aren't we going to center other communities? And I will own that and say it was done intentionally. This is the 5th of the series. The other 4 did not. The ones coming after will not center whiteness. I wanted to have this conversation because as a newcomer to Seattle, I have been struck by the unique white progressive reality of Seattle. And I thought the Evans School might be a good venue to spark some reflection among that group of people. Other comment to me is about the history of housing policy in the College of Built Environment and collaborations with the Evans School. And I would say that last night, the Dean of the College of Built Environment and I were drinking wine and thinking about how that kind of collaboration might happen. So to be continued on that. So in closing, we wanted to ask each of you to share very briefly specific things that people who were with us this afternoon might benefit from, things you're watching now, you're reading, things that resources, and that they could apply to their work if they're interested in these ideas. And we're going to be capturing these and sending it out to people afterwards. So what things could people do to continue to learn and deepen their own analysis and action in this space?
I guess just very practically continue self-reflection and inviting oneself to really look at the evidence of our actions. So what's the evidence for you today of doing something that disrupted injustice in a very practical, visible way, even if it is very small? Thank you.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. It is a thrill every time I get asked to come back to the Evans School, because I know that many of the students and audience members that participate in events like this are recognize the impact that public policy can have on systems change, which is why I enrolled in the Evans School and why I do the work that I do now. The book that I have found that is the most grounded in that potential, that policy informs systems change, is this book, The Sum of Us, written by Heather McGee. Just came out on paperback recently. And we're super thrilled that the Children's Alliance is going to have her speak at our event that is coming up in June, the first week in June. I am in the chat putting an invitation to that event. And I hope that people who want to learn more about this issue, she has such a sophisticated analysis of how policies have had disproportionate impacts on Americans, in lots of different areas, and how we can work differently. The subtitle of the book is What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. And when I first read the book, I was like, we got to go and get her, because her analysis is spot on for all of our membership, all the people that support our work. And I think it is far broader than that group of people who are advocating for children's interests to public policy administrators who are thinking about public policy as the catalyst for societal change. And so I'm hoping, if it makes sense for you, that you can join us. It'll be a great way to go beyond talking about these issues to specifically acting on them.
Jennifer, any final words?
Well, to reiterate what the other panelists have said, thank you so much for inviting me. I don't often get an audience that are practitioners, so I appreciate you, tolerating my academic ease. But I would just say if Dean Sanford's talking about this white progressive community in Seattle, if you are in it or adjacent to it, if people are expressing white racially sympathetic views, can you drive that conversation towards a discussion of policy? Can you kind of articulate candidates that are standing up for those views or opposing them? My research suggests that many people just don't see this connection between genuinely feeling bad and doing anything about it. And you are policy experts. So to the extent you can guide them to the policy outlets for this emotion, hopefully we'll see a different tomorrow. So thank you again so much for including me.
Well, you're welcome. And there's thanks coming in the chat to you. For those of you who have participated with us, the recording and slides are going to come out early next week. We'll share with you some of these resources and connections to how to connect with the speakers after. As I said, this is an ongoing series at the Evans School. We are in it in the long term, so look forward to joining us at the next one, the next Dean's Forum on Race and Public Policy. Thanks so much.